The sobbing pierced through the rain beneath the concrete overpass, a desperate sound that cut through the storm like glass. I found them huddled against the cold stone pillar, a young woman holding a burning hot baby to her chest, both shivering in soaked clothes that clung to their skin. When she looked up at me through the downpour, I saw my late wife's unmistakable emerald eyes staring back. She clutched the feverish infant closer, suspicion flickering. "Are you my daughter?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The way her breath caught told me I'd just opened a door that some people had worked very hard to keep sealed. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is where you are now. 3 years ago, I was Austin Brooks, the man who built Brooks Construction from a single bulldozer into an empire worth $200 million. I directed half the skyscrapers downtown, developed entire neighborhoods from empty lots, employed thousands of families. But tonight, I was just a broken old man who couldn't sleep, haunted by dreams of his dead wife telling him to look closer, dig deeper, trust no one. Margaret had always been the smart one, the one who could read people like blueprints, spotting the flaws that would bring everything crashing down. In my dreams, she'd lean close to my ear the way she used to during business dinners, whispering warnings about handshakes that felt too firm, smiles that lasted too long, compliments that came too easily. "Austin," she'd say in that voice I missed more than breathing, "something's not right. You know it. Stop pretending you don't." Then I'd wake up alone in our king-sized bed, reaching for her side and finding only cold sheets and the lingering scent of her perfume that might have been real or might have been wishful thinking. The storm had been raging for 3 hours when I finally gave up on sleep. Derek had prepared my evening medications as always, the little crystal glass filled with pills that were supposed to help with memory, with sleep, with the anxiety that came from losing the love of your life. He'd sat beside me while I took them, his hand heavy on my shoulder, his voice gentle as he reminded me about tomorrow's appointment with the estate attorney. "Just a few more documents, Dad," he'd said, his dark hair perfectly styled even at this late hour. "Nothing complicated. You know how much I appreciate you trusting me to handle the details since Lily." He'd paused, letting the weight of that unfinished sentence settle between us like a stone. But something about those pills had started tasting different 6 months ago, leaving a metallic aftertaste that lingered long after I'd swallowed them. And my dreams of Margaret had become more urgent, more specific, filled with warnings I couldn't quite remember when I woke, but that left me feeling like I was forgetting something crucial. So instead of taking the pills that night, I'd palmed them, later flushing them down the toilet in my private bathroom. For the first time in months, my mind felt clear, sharp, and dangerous. That's when I decided to drive, to think, to remember what it felt like to be Austin Brooks instead of Derek's grieving patient. The rain had turned the interstate into a river of brake lights and flooding. I should have gone home, should have followed the routine Derek had established for my supposedly declining mental state. But my Bentley seemed to drive itself toward the old industrial district where I'd built my first apartment complex 40 years ago with borrowed money and stubborn determination. The area had declined since those early days, becoming a forgotten corner of the city where the homeless gathered under highway overpasses and the successful pretended they didn't exist. It was no place for a man in a $3,000 suit driving a car worth more than most people's houses. That's when I heard it. The sobbing that pierced through the rain beneath the concrete overpass, a desperate sound that cut through the storm like glass. I pulled over without thinking, my businessman's instincts overridden by something deeper, more primal. Margaret used to say I had a savior complex, that I couldn't resist rescuing things that were broken. I found them huddled against the cold stone pillar, a young woman holding a burning hot baby to her chest, both shivering in soaked clothes that clung to their emaciated frames. The scene hit me like a physical blow, stripping away 68 years of success and sophistication, reducing me to a father's most basic terror, children in danger. When she looked up at me through the downpour, I saw my late wife's unmistakable emerald eyes staring back from a face that had haunted my dreams for 3 years. The same eyes that had watched me from our wedding photos, that had sparkled with mischief when she was planning surprises, that had looked at me with infinite trust as cancer slowly stole her away. "Are you my daughter?" I whispered, my voice trembling as the impossible recognition crashed over me. The way her breath caught told me I'd just opened a door that some people had worked very hard to keep sealed. "Lily," I said, the name torn from my chest like a piece of my heart. My daughter, who was supposed to be dead, who I'd mourned and buried and grieved until the sorrow nearly killed me too. "Oh God, sweetheart, what have they done to you?" She clutched the feverish infant closer, suspicion flickering in those emerald eyes that were so much like Margaret's. "You're supposed to be sick," she said, her voice hoarse from the cold and something deeper years of pain that had carved themselves into her vocal cords. "Derek told me you had severe dementia, that seeing me would cause fatal shock. He showed me medical reports about your condition. The lie hit me like ice water, crystallizing 3 years of growing suspicions into absolute certainty. Derek, my son-in-law, who had held my hand at Lily's funeral. Derek, who had moved into our home to help me cope with losing my only remaining family. Derek, who had somehow convinced my living daughter that I was dying while convincing me that she was gone forever. Derek lied about everything," I said, removing my coat and wrapping it around both of them, despite the rain that immediately soaked through my shirt. "But that ends tonight. We're going home, and then we're going to make him answer for every single thing he's done to our family." As we walked toward my car, Lily stumbling from exhaustion and months of malnutrition, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 3 years, the cold, calculating focus that had built an empire. Derek thought he was playing against a grieving old man with a failing memory. He was about to discover his mistake. The mansion rose from the darkness like a fortress, its Georgian columns and perfectly manicured grounds a stark contrast to the desperation we'd just left behind. I could see Derek's silhouette moving behind the silk curtains of the living room, probably preparing another evening of carefully orchestrated care for his declining father-in-law. Another round of medications to keep me compliant. Another set of documents that needed my signature before my supposed memory deteriorated further. For 3 years, I'd been the perfect victim. Wealthy, recently widowed, overwhelmed by grief and the complexity of managing a business empire alone. I signed papers without reading them, trusted his judgment over my own, allowed him to gradually isolate me from old friends and business associates. "He's going to panic when he sees me," Lily said as we approached the front door, Emma's labored breathing cutting through the sound of rain on stone. Her hand shook as she reached for the brass knocker, then pulled back as if the metal might burn her. "3 weeks ago, when I came back after discovering you were alive, he told me you had severe dementia. He showed me fake medical reports, convincing me that any shock could kill you." I studied her gaunt face in the amber glow of the porch lights, seeing not just the physical resemblance to Margaret, but the sharp intelligence she'd always possessed. Even after months of living rough, after whatever psychological manipulation Derek had subjected her to, she understood the impossible trap he'd created for her. "Legal documents can be fabricated," I said, inserting my key into the lock that still recognized me as the master of this house, despite 3 years of systematic attempts to make me doubt my own competence. "But the truth has a way of surfacing when you apply the right pressure." The heavy oak door swung open with a familiar creak. Immediately, Derek's footsteps echoed across the marble foyer. Italian leather shoes, I noted, purchased with money stolen from accounts that should have been providing for Lily and Emma. He appeared at the top of the grand staircase like an actor making his entrance, every detail of his appearance perfect despite the late hour. "Austin, thank God," he called down, his voice carrying that practiced note of relief that had once seemed so genuine. "I was terrified when I couldn't find you. With the storm and your medication schedule, I was afraid." His voice died as his eyes found Lily. The transformation was instantaneous and devastating. Color drained from his face like water from a broken dam. His perfectly manicured hand gripped the mahogany banister with such force I could hear his knuckles crack from 20 feet away. For 3 years, he'd worn the mask of a devoted son-in-law so skillfully that I'd begun to think it was his true face. This was his true face. Shock, calculation, and something that looked suspiciously like murder. What is she doing here? The question came out raw, unfiltered, stripped of all pretense. In that moment, I saw Derek as he really was, not the grieving widower who'd saved me from isolation and confusion, but a predator who'd been playing a long game with surgical precision. "Hello, Derek," Lily said quietly, her voice carrying a dignity that surprised me. Despite everything he'd done to her, months of living like an animal while her daughter slowly died from neglect, she hadn't let him destroy the fundamental strength I remembered from her childhood. "I'm not dead." Surprise. Emma chose that moment to let out a weak cry that echoed through the foyer like an indictment. Derek's gaze snapped to the baby with an expression I'd never seen before, the cold assessment of someone calculating how to eliminate an inconvenient witness. "That's impossible," he whispered, descending the stairs with mechanical precision. "You died 3 years ago. I was at your funeral. We both were." He gestured toward me as if I might confirm the elaborate fiction we'd both lived with. "And even if you were somehow alive, showing up here could trigger a cardiac episode in Austin's current condition." Dr. Martinez arrived within 10 minutes of my call, his medical bag in hand and his silver hair disheveled from being roused at midnight. He'd been making house calls to this address for 2 decades and had treated everything from Lily's childhood broken arm to Margaret's final pneumonia. His presence brought sanity into a room crackling with deception and barely contained violence. One look at Emma was enough. "Severe pneumonia, malnutrition, signs of prolonged exposure," he said grimly, his hands gentle as he examined the tiny patient on our living room sofa. "This child has been critically ill for weeks, possibly months. Whoever's been responsible for her care should be facing criminal charges." Derek had frozen at the bottom of the staircase, his lawyer's mind probably calculating damage control strategies. "This is impossible," he kept repeating, but his voice had lost all authority. "Lily died. I have documentation. I have witnesses, and Austin's condition is too fragile for this kind of shock." "What kind of documentation?" I asked, settling into my leather chair with the deliberate movements of a man who was about to enjoy destroying his enemy. "The kind you can forge with the right connections? The kind that doesn't hold up under FBI scrutiny?" His eyes widened slightly at the mention of federal investigation, and I saw the first crack in his composure. For 3 years, he'd been playing against a grieving old man whose judgment was clouded by medication and sorrow. He was about to discover that the medication had stopped working 6 months ago, and the grief had transformed into something far more dangerous. "I have medical reports documenting your cognitive decline," he said, but his voice had developed a tremor that betrayed his desperation. "Multiple doctors have confirmed your inability to make complex decisions. No court would accept your testimony over documented medical evidence." Dr. Martinez looked up from treating Emma, his expression sharp with professional interest. "What doctors? What medical reports? I'm Austin's primary physician, and I've never been consulted about any cognitive issues." The silence that followed was deafening. Derek's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water, his carefully constructed narrative beginning to collapse under the weight of simple questions. "The specialists you recommended," he finally managed. "Dr. Patterson from the geriatric psychiatry department, Dr. Wells from the memory clinic. They've been monitoring Austin's condition for over a year." "Neither of those doctors exist," Dr. Martinez said flatly. "I know every geriatric specialist in this city. There's no Dr. Patterson, no Dr. Wells, no memory clinic conducting evaluations on Austin Brooks." I watched Derek's face cycle through emotions as his web of lies unraveled in real time. This was the moment I'd been preparing for since my dreams of Margaret had become too urgent to ignore, since I'd started questioning pills that tasted wrong and documents I couldn't remember signing. "Derek," I said quietly, opening the folder I'd been assembling in secret for months, "I think it's time we discussed exactly what you've been doing with my money, my property, and my family." The reckoning had begun. I spread the contents of the folder across the coffee table. Bank statements, transfer records, property deeds, and photographs that painted a picture of systematic theft spanning 3 years. Derek watched from across the room, his breathing shallow and rapid, his perfect composure cracking like ice under pressure. "Let's start with the money," I said, my voice carrying the calm authority I'd used in boardrooms when negotiations turned hostile. $3,400,000 transferred from my accounts to various LLCs registered in your name. Care to explain the business purpose of these transactions? Lily shifted Emma to her other arm, her eyes scanning the documents with the quick intelligence Margaret had always possessed. Even weakened by months of hunger and psychological manipulation, she could read financial statements like blueprints, understanding immediately what she was seeing. "He's been stealing from you," she said quietly, her voice heavy with recognition. "That's why he had to make us both disappear." I would have seen the bank statements, asked questions about changes to family financial arrangements. I would have remembered that Mom left specific trusts for her future grandchildren. The mention of Margaret's trusts hit Derek like a physical blow. He'd counted on those family provisions being forgotten in the chaos of grief and his careful management of my declining mental state. But Margaret had been methodical about protecting future generations, setting aside millions specifically for grandchildren she'd never meet. "Those trusts were dissolved," Derek said quickly, his voice taking on the confident tone he used when explaining complex financial matters to his supposedly confused father-in-law. The tax implications were prohibitive. Austin agreed that consolidating everything into a single estate would be more efficient. "I never agreed to dissolve Margaret's trusts," I said, pulling out another set of documents. "But someone forged my signature on the paperwork. Someone who had access to my private office, my personal files, my handwriting samples from 40 years of business correspondence." Dr. Martinez had finished treating Emma and was now documenting his findings with the thoroughness of someone who understood these notes might become evidence. "The baby's condition is consistent with prolonged neglect," he said without looking up from his charts. "Malnutrition, untreated infections, failure to thrive. This didn't happen overnight." "I couldn't take her to the doctors," Lily said, her voice breaking slightly. "Derek convinced me that even though you were alive, I was still legally dead. For 3 years in Portland, he sent medication and money monthly, keeping me compliant and isolated. Then 3 weeks ago, when my shipment was delayed and my head finally cleared, I saw a newspaper article about Brooks Construction and realized he'd been lying about your death, too." The scope of Derek's control was staggering. He'd kept Lily dependent and isolated in Portland for 3 years, using medication and financial control to prevent her from thinking clearly or seeking help. When she'd discovered the truth and returned, he'd simply adapted his lies. "When I came back to find you," Lily continued, her voice growing stronger as the drugs finally cleared her system completely, "Derek intercepted me. He showed me fake medical reports about your dementia, convincing me that any shock could kill you. He said I had to stay away to protect your life, that revealing myself would cause a fatal cardiac episode. While you were being controlled from Portland for 3 years, I added, my voice heavy with understanding of Derek's complete manipulation. Derek was here, playing the devoted son-in-law, slowly taking control of every aspect of my life while I grieved a daughter who was still alive. The funeral that had nearly killed me with sorrow. Standing beside an empty coffin while a minister spoke about the tragic waste of a young life, about addiction's power to destroy families. Derek had been perfect in his role as grieving husband, accepting condolences with quiet dignity, speaking movingly about Lily's struggle with demons she couldn't overcome. I was so grateful for his support, I continued, the words bitter in my mouth. A young man who could have walked away from an old man's grief, but instead chose to stay and help him heal. He moved into the guest room temporarily, just until I felt strong enough to manage alone. The guest room that gradually became his permanent residence. The temporary arrangement that evolved into complete control over my household, my schedule, my medications, my legal affairs. Each step had seemed reasonable, even necessary, for a man drowning in loss and unable to function without assistance. "You exploited both our love for each other?" Lily said, her voice carrying 3 years of accumulated pain. "You kept me drugged and isolated in Portland for 3 years. Then when I discovered Dad was alive, you convinced me that contact would kill him. You made me choose between staying away to protect him or risking his life by revealing myself." Derek turned from the window, and for a moment I saw him without any mask at all. Not the devoted son-in-law or the grieving husband, but someone who viewed other people as resources to be exploited, obstacles to be removed, or tools to be used in service of his own advancement. "I saved you both," he said, his voice taking on a different quality entirely. Harder, more confident, stripped of all pretense. Austin was destroying himself with grief. Lily was having severe postpartum depression episodes, threatening to hurt herself and the baby. I created a solution that protected everyone while ensuring the family assets were managed responsibly. "Protected?" Lily's voice was dangerously quiet. "You drugged me into compliance for 3 years, convinced me my father was dead. Then when I discovered the truth, you made me believe that seeing me would kill him. You let my daughter nearly die while you lived in a mansion bought with stolen money." The answer came in the form of another document I pulled from my folder, a will revision that would have transferred 60% of my estate to Derek upon my death, including controlling interest in Brooks Construction and this house where 4 generations of my family had lived. "You were protecting your inheritance," I said quietly, "your reward for 3 years of systematic abuse disguised as devoted care." But the most devastating revelation was yet to come, hidden in the medical records Derek thought no one would ever see. From my desk drawer, I withdrew the device that had been my insurance policy for 6 months. A digital recorder, no larger than a credit card, the same type Margaret used to use for her garden club meetings. Derek's eyes fixed on it with the intensity of someone watching a loaded gun being pointed in their direction. "You've been very talkative lately," I said, pressing the play button, "especially during your phone conversations with people you thought I'd never meet." Derek's voice filled the room with crystal clarity. "The dementia is progressing faster than expected, Dr. Patterson. He's becoming more agitated, more confused about dates and financial arrangements. Yes, I've been increasing the dosage as you recommended. The sleeping medication seems to help with the evening episodes." The recording captured months of conversations about my supposed cognitive decline, each call more damning than the last. Derek's tone was clinical, detached, professional, as he discussed symptoms I'd never experienced with doctors who didn't exist. "That's illegal recording," Derek said, but his voice had lost all authority. "California requires 2-party consent for private conversations. It won't hold up in any court." "Actually," I replied, fast-forwarding to another segment, "this house has been wired for security since Margaret's jewelry was stolen 15 years ago. Every room, every phone line, every conversation. The disclosure signs are posted at every entrance, exactly as required by law." His voice emerged again, this time speaking to someone I'd never been allowed to meet. "We need to accelerate the timeline. Austin's asking too many questions about the trust dissolution. Yes, I can handle the power of attorney paperwork, but we need those medical evaluations completed before he becomes suspicious." Lily had gone completely still, Emma sleeping peacefully in her arms while she processed the scope of conspiracy she was hearing. "How many people were involved?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "At least 6, I said, consulting notes I'd been compiling. "A fake doctor to prescribe medications that would keep me compliant, a lawyer to handle forged documents, a funeral director willing to substitute death certificates, a coroner who could be bought, an actor to play medical specialists during supposed consultations." The web of corruption was staggering in its complexity. Derek hadn't been working alone. He'd assembled an entire network of professionals willing to participate in elder abuse for the right price. "But the most interesting conversation," I continued, finding the recording I'd been saving for this moment, "happened 3 weeks ago." Derek's voice filled the room again, but this time he was speaking to someone whose identity would destroy him completely. Lily's becoming a problem. She's getting suspicious about being cut off from the world, asking too many questions about why she can't contact anyone. We need to eliminate the variable before it compromises everything. The words hit Lily like physical blows. Eliminate the variable? Her voice cracked on the phrase. You were planning to have me committed? Not committed, Derek said quickly, his desperation finally breaking through his composure. But you were becoming unstable, asking too many questions about why you couldn't contact anyone from your old life. There are private facilities for people struggling with identity issues, delusions about being someone who's legally dead. Dr. Martinez had been listening with growing horror, his medical bag forgotten as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. The medications you were giving them both. I recognize the symptoms now. Lily, you were experiencing classic signs of benzodiazepine dependency mixed with mood stabilizers. These drugs would have made you extremely susceptible to suggestion, unable to think clearly or question information being presented to you. That's why I believed him, Lily whispered, the final piece of the puzzle falling into place. I wasn't thinking clearly. I was grieving, medicated, isolated from everyone I'd ever known. When he showed me fake obituaries and death certificates, when he explained that I was legally dead and Emma would be taken away if I tried to prove otherwise, it seemed logical. The drugs made everything seem reasonable. Derek's breathing had become rapid and shallow. He was calculating now, not how to explain his actions, but how to minimize the damage, how to salvage whatever he could from a situation spiraling completely beyond his control. I want to know about my mother's final letter, Lily said suddenly, her voice carrying a new hardness I'd never heard before. You told me she'd written something before she died, expressing disappointment in how I'd turned out after my depression. You said it was too painful for Dad to show me, but that you'd read it and could summarize the contents. My chest tightened with fresh rage. Margaret's final letter to her daughter had been a masterpiece of love and hope, filled with pride for the strong woman Lily was becoming and excitement about the grandchildren she hoped to spoil someday. I'd read it to Lily a dozen times during her recovery from postpartum depression. There was no letter of disappointment, I said quietly. Your mother's final letter spoke of her pride in you, her excitement about Emma, her hope that you'd find happiness again after the depression lifted. Derek took that letter from my desk 6 months after she died. The psychological manipulation had been surgical in its precision. Derek had systematically destroyed Lily's support network, convincing her that her family was disappointed in her struggles. He used medication to make her compliant enough to believe his elaborate fiction about everyone being dead or dying. Show me the letter, Lily said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. Show me what my mother really said. I walked to my safe, where Margaret's final words had been protected like the precious document they were. The letter was worn from handling, creased from the dozens of times I'd read it during the darkest periods of grief, when missing my wife felt like drowning in slow motion. Lily read in silence, her free hand shaking as she traced her mother's handwriting. When she finished, she looked up at Derek with an expression that mixed pity and contempt in equal measure. You stole her voice, she said quietly. You took away my mother's love and tried to replace it with shame. You made me believe I was worthless when she thought I was everything. Derek backed toward the doorway, his movements becoming frantic as he realized that every word was another nail in his coffin. I was protecting you from unrealistic expectations, he said desperately. Your mother saw you through rose-colored glasses. I showed you the truth about your limitations. The only truth, I said, standing slowly and facing him across the room where 3 years of lies were finally being exposed, is that you're a parasite who destroys families for profit. But parasites die when their host becomes too strong to feed on. I pulled out my phone with deliberate slowness. Detective Harrison, we're ready for you now. Through the window, we could see the unmarked police car that had been waiting in our circular driveway for the past hour, its occupant finally receiving the signal that our careful orchestration was complete. Derek's face went white as he realized that every exit had been blocked, every escape route anticipated. The hunter had become the hunted, and there was nowhere left to run. Detective Harrison's footsteps echoed across the marble foyer like a countdown to Judgment Day. Derek stood frozen in our living room, his perfect composure finally shattered completely, his mind racing through options that grew more limited with each passing second. Through the tall windows, I could see backup units taking positions around the property. This wasn't a simple arrest, but the culmination of a federal investigation that had been building for months. "Mr. Stevens," Detective Harrison said as he entered, his voice carrying the professional courtesy that preceded formal charges. "I'm Detective Harrison, Financial Crimes Division. We'd like to ask you some questions about irregularities in several bank accounts and trust funds registered to Austin Brooks." Derek's lawyer training kicked in despite his panic. "I'm not answering any questions without legal representation. This is harassment based on the confused testimony of an elderly man with documented cognitive issues and someone who's been legally dead for 3 years." The accusation was expertly crafted, designed to undermine our credibility while positioning himself as the victim of a coordinated attack. In different circumstances, it might have worked. He'd been preparing these defenses for months, anticipating the possibility that his deception might be discovered. "Actually," Detective Harrison said, consulting his notes, "we've been investigating this case for 6 months, ever since Mr. Brooks contacted the FBI about suspected elder abuse and financial fraud. We have substantial evidence that doesn't rely on anyone's testimony." He gestured toward Lily and Emma. "We also have a young woman who was declared dead 3 years ago, somehow alive and caring for a baby who's been systematically denied medical care, while believing her father was dying. That's going to require some explanation." Derek's breathing became more rapid as he realized the scope of the investigation. This wasn't a family dispute that could be settled privately. It was a federal case involving identity fraud, elder abuse, child endangerment, and conspiracy across state lines. "The death certificate was legitimate," he said desperately. "Lily died in Portland from an overdose. Austin's grief and cognitive decline have created a fantasy where he believes this woman is his daughter. I don't know who she is, but she's obviously exploiting his confusion." Detective Harrison pulled out a tablet, swiping to display forensic reports that had been prepared in advance. "Fingerprints taken from Lily's employment records match prints we collected tonight. Dental records from her childhood dentist confirm identity. DNA testing will be definitive, but we already have enough evidence to proceed with charges." I watched Derek's face cycle through emotions as each piece of evidence destroyed another element of his carefully constructed defense. He'd been extraordinarily thorough in his deception, but he'd underestimated the resources that an angry billionaire could bring to bear when his family was threatened. "How long have you known?" Lily asked me, her voice steady despite everything she was learning. "How long have you been planning this confrontation?" "I started suspecting something was wrong 8 months ago," I admitted, settling back into my chair with the satisfaction of someone whose long game was finally paying off. Small things at first. Documents I didn't remember signing, medications that tasted different, conversations about my declining health that didn't match my actual experience. The admission seemed to calm Lily, even as it terrified Derek. But the real confirmation came when I hired a private investigator to look into your supposed death. It took him 3 weeks to find you living under that bridge. I've been wrestling with whether to approach you directly or gather more evidence first. Derek's composure cracked completely. 3 weeks. His voice rose to a pitch that suggested complete psychological breakdown. You knew where she was for 3 weeks and left her there? You left a dying baby in those conditions just to collect evidence? The accusation was designed to make me the villain, to shift moral responsibility from his systematic abuse to my strategic patience. It hit exactly the guilt I'd been carrying, watching my daughter suffer while I built an airtight case against the man who'd destroyed our family. Tonight was supposed to be reconnaissance, I admitted, the weight of my decision heavy in my voice. I came to observe from a distance, to understand her situation better before deciding how to approach. I never intended for her to see me. But when I heard Emma crying through the storm, when I saw how desperately ill she was, I couldn't wait any longer. I left them there because I needed irrefutable proof of your crimes, I said, my voice hard as granite. I needed evidence that would convict you and recover every stolen dollar. I needed documentation that would ensure you'd never hurt another family. I gestured toward Dr. Martinez, who was documenting Emma's condition with professional thoroughness. And I had medical professionals monitoring them constantly, providing food and supplies, making sure they survived long enough for justice to be served. Detective Harrison had been taking notes throughout our conversation, his expression growing more grim as the scope of Derek's conspiracy became clear. Mr. Stevens, you're under arrest for elder abuse, financial fraud, identity theft, child endangerment, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The handcuffs clicked closed around Derek's wrists, with a sound like destiny being fulfilled. He'd spent 3 years systematically destroying our family while living in luxury built on stolen money and fabricated devotion. Now he was just another criminal being processed by a system he'd thought he was too smart to be caught by. "This isn't over," he said, as Detective Harrison began reading him his rights. "I have documentation spanning years, medical opinions from respected physicians, legal documents with Austin's own signature. No jury will convict me based on the confused testimony of a senile old man and someone who's been legally dead." "Actually," Detective Harrison said, consulting his tablet again, "we have something better than testimony. We have recorded conversations spanning 6 months, financial records showing systematic theft, and medical evidence that both Austin and Lily were being drugged without their knowledge or consent." He showed Derek the screen displaying laboratory analysis of the pills I'd been saving instead of taking. Sedatives, mood stabilizers, and mild hallucinogens designed to create confusion and dependency. The same substances we found in Lily's system during her time in Portland. Administered without medical supervision by someone with no legal authority to prescribe controlled substances. Derek's face went ashen as he realized that every aspect of his conspiracy had been documented and analyzed by federal investigators. His carefully crafted narrative of devoted care was crumbling under the weight of scientific evidence. "The pills were prescribed by Dr. Patterson," he said weakly. "I was following medical instructions for Austin's cognitive decline." "Dr. Patterson doesn't exist," Detective Harrison replied flatly. "Neither does Dr. Wells, the memory clinic, or any of the medical facilities you claimed were treating Austin. We've checked every database, every licensing board, every hospital in 3 states. As they led Derek away in handcuffs, he looked back at me with an expression that mixed desperation and genuine confusion, as if he couldn't understand how his perfect plan had unraveled so completely. "I saved this family," he said, his voice breaking on the words. "Everything I did was to protect Austin from making decisions that would have destroyed everything he'd worked for." "You destroyed everything yourself," Lily said quietly, Emma sleeping peacefully in her arms despite the chaos around her. "You took away our choices, our connections, our trust in each other. You convinced me I was dead to the world and made my father believe I was dead to him." As the police cars pulled away from our circular driveway, carrying Derek toward a justice system that would finally hold him accountable for 3 years of systematic abuse, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Margaret's death. The profound satisfaction of knowing that truth had prevailed over deception, that family bonds had proven stronger than the forces that sought to destroy them. The reckoning was complete, but the healing was just beginning. 8 months later, I stood in the same living room where Derek's elaborate deception had finally been exposed. But everything had changed in ways both profound and subtle. The space felt alive again, filled with the sounds of a family learning to trust each other after years of systematic manipulation and calculated betrayal. Lily sat cross-legged on the Persian rug Margaret had chosen 30 years ago, her laptop open beside her as she reviewed architectural plans for Brooks Construction's newest development project. Emma, now strong and healthy at 16 months old, used her mother's leg as support while she practiced walking between furniture pieces, her delighted squeals echoing off walls that had been silent for too long. The transformation in both of them had been remarkable to witness. Emma had blossomed under proper medical care and consistent nutrition, growing from the frighteningly thin baby I'd found under that bridge into a robust toddler with Margaret's emerald eyes and her mother's determined chin. She'd said her first words in this room, taken her first steps on these floors, filled our home with the kind of joy that money couldn't buy, but Derek had nearly stolen forever. Lily's recovery had been more complex, involving layers of psychological healing that went far beyond physical health. Dr. Martinez had confirmed that her system was finally clear of the cocktail of drugs Derek had been administering since Emma's birth, but rebuilding trust in her own perceptions and judgment had taken months of specialized therapy to overcome the systematic gaslighting she'd endured. The prosecution called this morning. Detective Harrison had told us the week before, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd seen justice served in a case that could have easily gone the other way. Derek pleaded guilty to all charges rather than face trial: elder abuse, financial fraud, identity theft, child endangerment, conspiracy to commit fraud across state lines. The federal judge sentenced him to 14 years without possibility of parole. He'd paused, studying my reaction carefully. The restitution order covers $4.6 million in stolen assets, plus damages for psychological trauma inflicted on you and Lily. He'll also be required to pay for Emma's medical care and Lily's therapy for the next 5 years. I'd nodded, feeling neither triumph nor sympathy for the man who'd systematically destroyed our family while living in luxury built on lies. What matters is that he can never do this to another family, I'd said. Money can be replaced. Trust takes longer to rebuild. Now, watching Emma giggle as she stumbled toward Lily's outstretched arms, I understood what real wealth looked like. Not the millions in restored bank accounts, or the business empire that had doubled in value since Lily joined the company, but these moments of pure connection between generations who'd been kept apart by greed disguised as care. I still have nightmares sometimes, Lily admitted, closing her laptop to give Emma her full attention. Dreams where I wake up under that bridge, and this is all a hallucination brought on by hypothermia. Dreams where Derek appears with legal documents proving I'm still dead and Emma doesn't belong to me. The trauma of 3 years spent believing her father was dead because of her, combined with months of homelessness while convinced she was legally non-existent, had left psychological scars that would take time to heal completely. But she was fighting through the recovery with the same determination that had kept Emma alive during those desperate months when survival seemed impossible. Sometimes I dream about Margaret, I said, settling into my leather chair that had witnessed so much pain and revelation over the past year. But now she's smiling, relieved that the truth finally came out. She always said I had good instincts about people, but that I ignored them when I wanted to believe someone was family. The months since Derek's arrest had brought unexpected gifts, along with the challenges of healing. Lily had thrown herself into learning the construction business with enthusiasm. I want Emma to grow up knowing she's valued for who she is, not what she represents, she said, lifting her daughter and spinning her gently until she shrieked with delight. I want her to understand that family means protection without conditions, love without manipulation, trust that doesn't have to be earned through perfect behavior. Emma had become the bridge between generations, her presence healing wounds that neither Lily nor I could have addressed alone. Watching her daughter thrive with such tenderness and fierce protectiveness, I could see the woman Lily had always been underneath the confusion and fear that Derek had systematically created. The hardest part, she continued, her voice thoughtful as Emma settled into her lap with a picture book, was learning to trust reality again. Derek had convinced me that my own perceptions were wrong, that what I remembered about our family was distorted by depression and grief. He made me believe that seeking help or trying to reconnect would only cause more pain. The psychological manipulation had been surgical in its precision, targeting the vulnerabilities that came from postpartum depression and the isolation of new motherhood. Derek had systematically destroyed Lily's support network, convinced her that her family was disappointed in her struggles, then used medication to make her compliant enough to believe his elaborate fiction about everyone being dead or dying. He weaponized our love for each other, I said, watching Emma point at pictures while Lily read in the animated voice that always made her laugh. He used our desire to protect each other as tools for keeping us apart, convincing us both that contact would be destructive. But rather than dwelling on the damage Derek had caused, we'd focused on rebuilding what he'd tried to destroy. Family dinners around the table that had been empty for too long. Business meetings where Lily's fresh perspective challenged assumptions I'd held for decades. Quiet evenings when Emma's bedtime stories filled rooms that had echoed with loneliness during the years of deception. "I've been thinking about forgiveness," Lily said as Emma grew sleepy against her chest, her energy finally depleted after a day of exploration and play. "Not for Derek. I don't think I'll ever forgive what he did to Emma, how he let her suffer while living in luxury built on stolen money. But forgiving myself for believing his lies, for not fighting harder to contact you." The question of self-forgiveness had been central to both our recoveries. I'd struggled with guilt about not recognizing Derek's manipulation earlier, about signing documents without reading them carefully. "Forgiveness isn't always about the person who wronged you," I said, thinking about the therapy sessions that had helped me process 3 years of stolen time and violated trust. Sometimes it's about freeing yourself from carrying their poison around like a tumor that keeps growing. As evening approached and we prepared for another family dinner, a ritual that had become sacred in ways I'd never appreciated during Lily's childhood, I found myself thinking about legacy, about the stories Emma would inherit about strength and resilience and the unbreakable bonds that define real family. She would grow up knowing that her grandfather had fought for her before she was old enough to understand what fighting meant. She would hear stories about her mother's courage during the darkest period of her life, how she'd protected her when protection seemed impossible. She would understand that love sometimes requires patience, strategy, and the willingness to sacrifice immediate comfort for long-term justice. "Tomorrow we break ground on the new housing development," Lily said as we moved toward the dining room. "Affordable housing for young families, with built-in support services and medical clinics. I want to name it Margaret's Gardens." The project had been her idea, a way to honor the mother she missed every day, but whose values had shaped everything positive in our family's history. Margaret would have loved the symmetry using resources that Derek had tried to steal to create homes for families who needed protection and support. "She would be proud," I said, watching her secure Emma in her chair while she babbled happily about her day, "not just of the project, but of the woman you've become despite everything that tried to break you." As we shared our evening meal together, 3 generations around a table that represented continuity, resilience, and the triumph of truth over deception, I realized that Derek's greatest failure hadn't been his greed or cruelty or willingness to endanger a child in service of his own ambitions. His greatest failure had been his fundamental misunderstanding of what held families together. He believed that love was just another tool for manipulation, that trust was a weakness to be exploited, that loyalty could be purchased with the right combination of care and control. But real family bonds aren't built on convenience or maintained through coercion. They're forged through shared struggles, tested by genuine crises, and strengthened by the choice to keep fighting for each other even when fighting seems hopeless. The storm that had brought Lily and Emma back into my life had long since passed, leaving behind clear skies and the promise of better weather ahead. In its place was something quieter but infinitely more powerful, The simple, profound satisfaction of knowing that truth had prevailed, that justice had been served, and that love, however tested by deception and betrayal, had proven stronger than the forces that sought to destroy it. Emma's laughter filled the dining room as Lily made silly faces over her dinner, the sound echoing through a house that felt alive again with the energy of people who belonged together. This was what Derek had tried to steal, not just money or property, but connection, legacy, the irreplaceable bonds that make life meaningful across generations. As I watched my daughter teach her daughter to clap her hands and count to 3, I felt Margaret's presence like a blessing, her approval of the family we were rebuilding together. The house that had been a mausoleum during the years of deception had become a home again, filled with the sounds and energy of people who had survived the worst that human greed could inflict and emerged not just intact but stronger for having faced the truth about what they meant to each other. There were still difficult days ahead. Emma would need ongoing medical monitoring to ensure no lasting effects from her early malnutrition. Lily continued therapy sessions twice a week, working through the complex trauma of believing herself dead to the world for 3 years. And I was learning to trust my own judgment again after being systematically gaslit by someone I'd considered family. But we faced these challenges together now, as a family should. No more secrets, no more lies, no more manipulation disguised as care. Derek's greatest weapon had been our separation, our inability to verify his stories with each other. United, we were stronger than any deception he could have crafted. Sometimes, late at night when the house was quiet, I would walk past Emma's nursery and hear Lily singing the same lullabies Margaret had sung to her 30 years ago. The melody carried through the hallway like a promise that love, however tested by betrayal and time, would always find its way back to where it belonged. Remember that family isn't just about blood relations. It's about the people who choose to fight for you when fighting seems hopeless, who see your value when the world tries to convince you you're worthless, and who never stop believing that love, however tested, will ultimately prevail over the forces that seek to divide us. If you found this story about family, betrayal, and the ultimate triumph of truth over deception meaningful, I'd be deeply grateful if you'd like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories about justice, redemption, and the unbreakable bonds that hold families together even in the darkest circumstances. Thank you for taking this emotional journey with me, for believing in the power of truth, and for understanding that sometimes the greatest victories come not from revenge, but from the simple act of refusing to let others define your worth or destroy the connections that make life meaningful.